My parents got married 40 years ago. They met at church when they were young, got married in a very small service, and then went on a holiday to Norway. Everything they did, and still do now, is modest. When they were in Norway, newlywed, they travelled by ferry, using their own car, camped in a tent instead of a hotel, and read The Lord of the Rings together. It was the first time for both of them, and they fell in love with it, and further in love with each other. This may not seem remarkable, as there are many people around the world who admire Tolkien's fantasy, but if you knew and understood my parents, then you might understand why this is a little bit special. My mother reads history books by Patrick O'Brian and has no interest in fantasy or science fiction. She fell asleep when we watched Star Wars and doesn't have the patience for anything that doesn't move quickly. My father is down to earth and not partial to flights of fancy. He likes Captain Corelli's mandolin and doesn't have time for superheroes or magic. He read Harry Potter to my sister and I as children, but I suspected he never enjoyed the story all too much. But then in 2001, my parents announced that they were going to the cinema together to watch The Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson's new film, and that I was staying with my grandma and my sister that night. I've never known my parents to go to the cinema by themselves before, or very rarely since then. The Lord of the Rings made things different, because it is different. It stands apart as one of the greatest pieces of entertainment ever conceived. Tolkien created something that captured the no-nonsense imaginations of my parents, and today I want to tell you how he did this. When my parents returned from the cinema, they announced that they were going to take my sister to watch The Fellowship of the Ring next weekend. I protested, but at the time they were concerned that the film might be too violent for a 7-year-old, so instead I was handed a very old copy of The Fellowship of the Ring that my mother had read when she was younger. I remember it was the biggest book I'd ever seen, and I did my best to read it, but for a child it was a bit too much. It wasn't until The Fellowship of the Ring was released on VHS and later on DVD that I realised how influential and formative this universe was about to be on younger me. Before the second film released, I had read the entire trilogy. I had watched the first film so many times to the point that I could recite the speeches. I would watch 20 minutes before school, another 30 minutes after school, and before dinner, every day. Mum and I watched The Two Towers twice when it came out, and I had my birthday party at the cinema for The Return of the King. I would ask for the toys for Christmas, received newer copies of the books, role-played my favourite scenes with my friends at school and with my sister on our farm. I was hooked. It wasn't until I was older and started to read the books in more detail, as well as find out more information about the great man J.R.R. Tolkien, that I started to understand why. I also started to realise the massively positive effect that the Lord of the Rings series, books, films, whatever, was having on my life and my view of the world. This led me to have an intense interest in the Lord of the Rings, and as I entered university and the internet became more common, I realised that my admiration of the man was not unique. But why am I telling you all of this? Well, the point is that my experience with the Lord of the Rings is not particularly unique. There are many people out there who have had the same experience with The Lord of the Rings or with different franchises who can understand my point of view. The issue here is that when I'm saying that The Lord of the Rings is the greatest story ever told, I'm obviously coming from a place of slight emotional bias. I have a deep and profound love for The Lord of the Rings, especially the books, and I've tried hard to make as objective a video as possible analysing why this series is so great. But it's important to note. I should make a clear disclaimer that I do not consider this work perfect, for it is art, and therefore subjective in nature and not without problems or valid critique. I do not consider this so superior to other great works that it looks down on them, nor is it the peak of what is possible in writing. What I am saying instead is that these works are timeless. They are intricate and worthy of veneration, and in order to explain why I feel that these are the best stories ever written, we need to understand the man who wrote them himself, Professor J.R.R. Tolkien. I will not give you a full biography of Tolkien. Better and more qualified people have done that before me and will do it after me, to levels and skills that I cannot reach yet. But it is important, if we're understanding why the books are so fantastic, that we do understand some of the background of the man who wrote them, and how formative and how important that has been on the story that was created in the end. For me, Tolkien represents that which many writers aspire to be. A man dedicated to his craft and humble in the face of success. There are few better literary role models out there who espouse the importance of hard work, attention to detail, and perseverance. More than that, Tolkien was no stranger to the hardships that life could deal out. Both of his parents passed away by the time he was 12. He was scorned for wishing to finish his studies rather than volunteer in the First World War. He was denied marriage to the woman of his dreams, though he did get her eventually, and many of his closest friends from school were killed during the war. These hardships are things that few of us nowadays in the modern world can imagine, but they were so instrumental to producing the world that Tolkien envisioned. They remind us of the importance of suffering in order to produce beauty. They remind many of us modern writers that we need to get out there and have real-world experiences beyond our screens so that we can imagine something bigger than ourselves. We only need to look around at some of the most successful authors in history to recognize that many of them had traumatic experiences or complex pasts that they funneled into their creative energy. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a prisoner in a gulag in Siberia for 11 years. J.K. Rowling was in an abusive relationship for years and lived on the dole as a single mother. Primo Levi was one of only 20 Italian Jews from an initial 650 to have survived Auschwitz. Sadako Kurihara remarkably survived the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, and Nguyen Pham Quay Mai grew up during the Vietnam War in abject poverty. The point I'm making is not to compare the suffering of these authors. In many ways, their experiences are incomparable, nor am I glorifying them in any way. But I am making the point that their suffering moulded their artistic talent and the works that they produced. There are countless examples of others having the same experience. Tolkien fits this mold, as he grew up orphaned in a time of war and could only rely on himself to succeed. Now, I don't want to become too stereotypical here with the tortured creative character motif I'm starting to conjure, but we should note that most writers display traits that reflect an openness to new experiences. This leaves them vulnerable to exposing themselves to more uncomfortable experiences too than many other people. In turn, these new experiences account for excess creativity, either as a coping strategy or as the result of inspiration. Let's leave this topic for now, as I will explore it more thoroughly in a future video, and let's turn back to Tolkien. On top of having many transformative experiences from a young age, what makes Tolkien so worthy of praise, in such a way that amplifies the power of the Lord of the Rings, is the professor's passion for what he was writing. It is clear from Tolkien himself that he loved fantasy from a young age, stating,
I first began seriously to invent languages about I was 13 or 14. I've never stopped, really. Languages have a flavour to me, which I never understand people saying, for instance, it was awfully dry and dull, because a new language to me is just like taking a new wine or a new sweetmeat or something. What I'm doing now is to try and write in Elvish, because my writing is very inferior to the Elv. Their standard greeting when meeting, a star shines upon our meeting. Oh, Lord. I've made a mistake, haven't I? And that stands for Ellen, Sila, Lumen, Aumenti Elvo. It's a rather beautiful language, I think.
Tolkien dedicated his life to his craft. He wrote extensively based on the writers who inspired him, as well as the experience that shaped his life and those around him. Tolkien channeled the things that he loved, like Norse mythology and English history, into his works. This gave them a deeper feeling and familiarity because they were based on things more primal. Moreover, Tolkien was not shy about his inspiration from people like William Morris, whose romantic and idealistic works clearly inspired Tolkien's romantic vision of Middle-earth. Or perhaps his love for George MacDonald's fairy tales and early fantasy novels that Tolkien read as a boy. Shakespeare's bardish prose and vivid characters were huge contributors to what makes The Lord of the Rings so impressive. And this is part of what makes the stories feel so real, what makes the world so immersive and the characters so alive. Because in a way, Tolkien wrote them as if they were, and they were based on things that already existed in the minds of many who read them. Tolkien spent decades filling out every nook and cranny of his creation, and the result is a comprehensive labour of love that translates onto the page. There are no other works that I know of where the writer wrote so few books but spent so much time planning them, mapping them out, getting every intricate detail correct, creating diverse languages and cultures and meshing them together using his life experience, love of mythology, and talent as a professor at Oxford. We often try to separate the writer and their works, but part of what makes The Lord of the Rings so great is how entwined the author is. A classic example is the tale of Beren and Luthien. Beren and Luthien is the love story in Tolkien's Legendarium between Beren, a mortal man, and Luthien, an immortal elf maiden. Like the real romance between Tolkien and his wife Edith, the couple faced many challenges that threatened to tear their relationship apart. Tolkien was a romantic at heart, and moved to Bournemouth to make Edith happy. They danced together in flower glades like Beren and Luthien, and when Edith passed away, the grief-stricken Tolkien had Luthien inscribed on her headstone. Later, Beren would be added to his. But it wasn't only a personal story. Tolkien didn't do that. Beren and Luthien also drew on the Finnish poem of Kalevala, of which Tolkien greatly admired, as well as the mythology from Wales with the story of Culhwch and Olwen. There is always more than what meets the eye in Tolkien's creations. So how can we not say that he put part of himself into the world that he was creating? And how can we also not say that this only improved the work as a result? A final point of note is Tolkien's Christian faith. J.R.R. Tolkien was a devout Roman Catholic, and his faith influenced his writing. He once even stated that, Tolkien's Christianity can be seen throughout his work, especially in the themes of good versus evil, the importance of free will, and the ultimate victory of good over evil. The character of Gandalf, for example, can be seen as a Christ-like figure, sacrificing himself for the greater good and being resurrected to continue the fight against evil. Tolkien was also critical of certain aspects of modern Christianity, such as the commercialization of Christmas and the loss of the beauty and mystery of the traditional liturgy. We don't have to follow his lead, or agree with his positions to note how this affected his work. It added an ethereal and universal quality to his work, which religion is very competent at doing. It allowed the story to feel more ancient, as it had actual ancient and religious blood in its veins. This only enhanced the power of the message, as it was also created from a place that trades in immensely powerful messages. Tolkien's love for nature, his hatred of war, his faith in Christianity, his experience using and understanding Norse and Anglo-Saxon languages, his passion for fairy tales, and his belief in the power of love and courage are all so deeply infused within the story from his personality, maybe to an extent that we've never seen before or since. But all of these pieces do not make something automatically a great story. To understand how Tolkien used these pieces to such great effect, we need to examine the writing.
「作った時の判断っていうのはやっぱり作者ですので、作者の手を離れたらもうあとは人が判断してくれるんですけれども、自分の手を離れる前、これを作品として出すか出さないかっていう判断は自分ですので、そこはやっぱり厳しくしておかないと、後々死んでからも作品は残りますので、もっとこう伝統文化として伝えるべきところはもっと別にあると思います。作り手のやはり気持ちっていうのも大切なことだと思います。どういう思いで作ったかっていうのは必ず作品に反映されると思います。それが手仕事の作品の一番の良さだと思います。
During my time living in Japan, I was so impressed and blown away by how diligently people dedicate themselves to their craft. Many of these people fall into that industry by accident, but then end up dedicating their entire life to perfecting the art through passion and hard work. And despite what you might think, Tolkien and the Japanese swordsmith have much more in common than meets the eye.
And you're only concerned with making a story?
It was my primary concern, which I started out with.
And you took 14 years to make this story?
Quite so, yes.
And this was a story in...
But that is partly out of the fact that I'm a meticulous sort of bloke. And that I took 14 years, not for the general things it is now, but refining time schemes and getting everything right and so on.
Well, for instance, this
Yes.
whole matter of the appendices, 100 pages, language, social customs, history. Normally, if you had been writing a history as a historian, all these would have existed on a card index before you ever began to write.
Yeah.
Is this true for the
Very
Lord
much
of the
so,
Rings?
yes. One thing that, for instance, in the remarks you made at the beginning was the fact that time passed and the hobbits grew into this world. As a matter of fact, what really happened was that, because having already constructed the world, they became drawn into it.
To many of us who have ever tried to write a book, Tolkien's words will resonate deeply. Despite the immense detail in his work, Tolkien had no plan. He perhaps did not even plan on becoming a writer. Instead, everything was written, by hand, in large leather-bound notebooks where he scribbled notes and thoughts and ideas for his world that he wished to fill. It started from his time in the First World War, when the Legendarium started to form, began to solidify with The Hobbit, and he finally began to write The Lord of the Rings in 1937. The books were not finished until 1949 and weren't even published until 1954 and 1955. In the past, I have described Tolkien as an architect-writer, but this was incorrect.
For all the architecture he did on, like, the Silmarillion, which he began before World War I, he started Lord of the Rings thinking he was writing a sequel to The Hobbit, and it would be another children's book about the adventures of a couple hobbits stealing something, and it obviously grew into something much larger than he ever expected.
Tolkien believed that the process of writing was a form of exploration, and that the story should be allowed to grow naturally as if it were a plant. He did not outline his story in advance, but instead nurtured them to unfold organically. Instead, a great deal of what he spent his time doing was editing, meticulously poring over everything to make sure it was perfect.
Then, of course, a tremendous revision. I typed the whole of that work out twice, and lots of it many times, on a bed in an attic. Because they couldn't afford the cost of typing. There were some mistakes too. And also, what amuses me to say, because I suppose I'm in a position which it doesn't matter what people think of me now, some frightful mistakes in grammar from a professor of English language literature, rather shocking.
Of course, achieving perfection is an ultimately subjective assessment, but that doesn't mean striving for it is a wasted endeavour. All that striving helps one to realise more fully what the story is, iron out inconsistencies, discover new avenues that should be opened up, and find ways to fine-tune all the lore. In Japan, where I spent a number of years, there is a concept called shokunin. It refers to the pursuit of mastery in a particular craft or profession through hard work, discipline, and continuous learning. It originated in the crafts industry and is exemplified in the swordsmith's attitude, which we saw earlier. It is about more than becoming skilled in a particular industry, however, and more broadly reflects the values that must be inhabited by the participant to achieve the lofty heights, such as humility, respect, and commitment to excellence. In Japanese culture, the pursuit of shokunin is seen as noble and honourable, and about more than achieving personal success or wealth, but about contributing something beautiful to society, while also preserving the traditions that inspired it. When we think about shokunin, how can we not imagine Tolkien fitting perfectly into that mould? He very much encompasses that dedication to craft with all the humility and higher order motivation.
Do you find a continuing interest in The Lord of the Rings by people? Do people still write to you on, despite the fact that the book's been out for 10 years?
Dozens of letters a week, yeah. Or I'd have to keep a secretary to answer them, yeah.
Were you surprised at its success?
Nobody made more staggered, yeah. Unless it was possibly Sir Stanley Admin. I was up at Stanley Admin's birthday celebration, and a bookseller came up to me. I don't usually greet him with such fervour. He said that while he got a copy, it sold so well it practically kept him going for a while. Well, he gets his guinea off the set, you see.
All of this, especially the quotes from the man himself, give us an idea why so many people have been sucked into this world. Tolkien was a perfectionist. He believed in creating something beautiful and dedicating his talents and his life to that art form. He was not chasing financial or commercial success or looking for fame. Instead, like the Japanese swordsmith, Tolkien was hoping to perfect an art, to contribute to his culture and to his society by making something that people could enjoy across generations, regardless of background. Tolkien was dedicated to producing something beautiful with care, attention, and love. When any of us come across something that has been created with those things in mind, rather than an outside motivation other than a creative outpouring of beauty, we know it sticks with us, because perfection lasts. The story of The Lord of the Rings is ultimately the most important part. It's what makes us want to watch the films again and again. It's what made my parents go to the cinema all those years ago, and it's the most valuable experience that I have from my childhood. The story of The Lord of the Rings is so instrumental to creating such a fantastic piece of work that we really need to spend quite a bit of time examining how it's so powerful and how it works so well.
To try my hand at writing a really stupendously long narrative, and to see whether I had sufficient art, cunning, or material to make a really long narrative which would hold the average reader right through.
Tolkien's motivation for writing The Lord of the Rings shows us so precisely why it is so memorable. Tolkien was trying to touch every human emotion within us in order to invest his audience in the world that he created. Given the proven success of his work, it's quite clear to see that he succeeded. But how did he succeed? What grains of magic did he sprinkle into his work that made them so successful? To really get into the story of The Lord of the Rings, we need to go back a bit further. Back to The Hobbit. The prequel book to the epic trilogy is described by Tolkien as for children, but importantly, The Hobbit provided a gateway into the world of Middle-earth.
The actual beginning, though it is not really the beginning, but the actual flashpoint was, I remember very clearly. I could still see the corner in my house in 20 Northmore Road where it happened. I got an enormous pile of exam papers there, and marking school examinations in the summertime is an enormous, very laborious, and unfortunately also boring. And I remember picking up a paper and actually I nearly gave an extra mark for it, extra 5 marks actually. There was one page on this particular paper was left blank. Glorious. Nothing to read. So I scribbled on it, I can't think why. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. I think that was eventually published in 1937.
It is commonly believed that it was made for his children, but that isn't quite accurate. It was meant to be something that would appeal to his children and others who enjoyed fantasy stories. He did not want to copy the stories from the past, so instead decided to draw on the power of epic tales, mythology, language, and his talent for storytelling to create something unique. Spurred on by the success of The Hobbit, Tolkien leaned harder into his background to create the famous trilogy. He dived deeper into the mythology, used his hobby as a philologist to study Kalevala and other German legends to ultimately produce the Legendarium. His son, Christopher, explains this process well.
In terms of actual content, of course, an important element in The Lord of the Rings, which plays no part in The Hobbit, I think, or in the Silmarillion, but plays a very important part in the Lord of the Rings, is the kingdom of Rohan, which is modelled on, in a sense, transformed. It's not supposed to be historical because it's in the secondary world, but the inspiration for Rohan derives very evidently from Anglo-Saxon England. And the philology does not derive from any direct imitation of real languages in the world. Not at all. But of course it does derive from his mastery of the history of actual languages.
By incorporating these ancient Germanic and Britannic cultures into his story, Tolkien imbued it with a sense of timelessness that makes it resonate with readers from any generation. These stories are already part of our collective heritage and represent powerful, almost primal understandings that we have about the world. They take us back to a time of mystery and wonder, with creatures such as dragons, trolls, wizards and elves all portrayed in realistic ways that trigger our imagination. The languages are based on ancient Northern European languages. The creatures and races such as dwarves and goblins are all from North European folklore, and this grounding in reality is what makes the story so believable.
I think that I would say that the appeal, the attraction lies in my father's extraordinary power of compelling literary belief in an unreal world, what he called a secondary world. That is, a world that exists only in the mind. It cannot be seen, cannot be found. It exists only in the mind. And many people have discovered, perhaps many people for the first time in their lives, have discovered that this is a very delightful thing. And this world that they enter proves to be an extraordinarily interesting place, with a long imagined past. In this world, strange beings, beautiful, noble, terrifying, hideous, strange places, strange events are encountered. But in this world of his devising, when you enter it, they are true. Their existence cannot be doubted so long as you're in that world, because they accord with the laws that govern it.
They create a sense of awe and reverence for the natural world and the history we have forgotten, especially in the UK and Northern Europe. More than that, by basing his own story on such solid foundations, it allows what could be a rather simple adventure tale to turn into something with gravitas and more universal appeal. On top of that, the story is not only allegorical, but something more.
People can of course find allegories if they wish to, but as you can see, it was wholly outside his conception of what he was doing in what he called fantasy. The world he created exists for itself, and for what it tells you, and for what delight it gives you. It may, of course, contain, as indeed it does, elements of his own comprehension, his view of the world at large, but not anything out of the primary world. Just as it contains no specific reference to the Christian religion, it actually contains no specific reference to communism or fascism, absolutely not. His view of such things, if available at all, will be in solution in the secondary, mythical or mythological world that he has created, but not actually itself. Therefore it is in no sense an allegory. The double meaning is not present.
So now let's look at what holds this story up to be so exceptional. For me, there are four main pillars to what make Tolkien's story and narrative so powerful. The first and most obvious is the writing style itself. As we've discussed, Tolkien was a perfectionist when it came to the words and ideas he integrated, but that ultimately led to a writing style that was rich with description, dialogue that flowed like poetry, story beats that were steeped in mythology, and human-centered monomyth ideas. His work has been criticised by some as being overly wordy, with too much description and blocks of expositional world building, and I do think this is valid, but it also allowed Tolkien to employ the full range of his writing talent. Descriptions of landscapes, people, and objects are vivid and intricate, enhanced with metaphors and similes that aren't cliched, and thus allow us to see the world he was creating, even if they are slightly over-expositional. For example, he described the Tower of Barad-dûr as a towering menace that burned red against the horizon, and vast clouds of smoke and ash hung like a shroud over the land. If that isn't good descriptive writing, I don't know what is. The second pillar is the detail of his writing is only possible because of the enormous amount of world building that was meticulously gathered beforehand. The maps, languages, complex histories, societal norms that are all established and woven into the narrative create an irresistible immersion for the reader. So much of it is only alluded to, and anybody who has read the Silmarillion knows how much isn't even spoken of in The Lord of the Rings, but this depth shows in the writing. Everything is deliberate, and Tolkien became a master of show don't tell. Even if everything isn't obvious, we get a sense that everything underneath works and fits like a real world, that the cultures and languages are fully formed. The story takes place in a fleshed out world that is fully formed and therefore avoids many of the contrivances and plot holes that are features of less developed work. If you're going to mention the eagles, well, Tolkien already has a response for you.
Why didn't they just fly the eagles to Mordor? It would have made the quest a whole lot easier. And I told him the same thing that I'm telling you right now. Shut up.
Thirdly, the story sticks with us because it taps into something very human within us. It focuses on positive themes of love, bravery, and hope that are so intrinsically human. Tolkien was careful to avoid allegory. He hated it, in fact. And this meant that the story that was based so heavily on powerful folklore and mythology was able to connect with anybody who felt like they were fighting an unwinnable battle and needed the hope and courage to carry on. The Lord of the Rings is inspirational in the stories of Frodo and Aragorn. It is cautionary with Boromir and Smeagol, it is empowering with the hobbits and Éowyn, it is courageous with Sam, and gentle but wise with Gandalf. While Tolkien himself never formally identified what messages he wanted to communicate with his work, there is a general consensus amongst scholars that at minimum it celebrates loyalty and the virtues of friendship.
Escape is a different question. He was there, perhaps more deeply hostile, because escape has often been used as a means of attack on the very conception of fantasy, of the secondary world. And he in a sense, he said, of course it is an escape, if you like, because it's a movement out of the primary world, which isn't such a pleasant place, into a secondary world that may not be very much more pleasant, but it's anyway very different. And there are terrors as well as beauties in the secondary world. But it is not. He said that his critics had chosen the wrong word. He said they were perhaps maliciously confounding the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter.
Well, it is meant to be escapist, because I use escapism in its proper sense. It was a man getting out of prison.
Fourthly, another criticism levelled at the story is that it can often feel black and white, with few ambiguous characters, like in more modern fantasy franchises such as A Song of Ice and Fire.
I don't know if he actually subscribed to it, but certainly Lord of the Rings endorses this thing that you see in a lot of fantasy, which is the belief that a good man will be a good king, which is a reassuring belief that we would have. We like to think that the leaders that we support are good men, and the leaders that we oppose are maybe less good men, or in some cases bad men, because they have bad policies. But if you actually look at history, it's far more, you can't just say, and then Aragorn became king and ruled wisely for 1,000 years. I want to know, okay, what were Aragorn's policies as king?
But this criticism seems to misunderstand what makes the story so powerful. The clear distinction between good and evil is what makes the books so compelling. The moral clarity that is communicated in the fight against evil gives readers a sense of purpose and meaning. It is more inspirational than realistic, but that is by design. Tolkien wanted to make a mythological epic, not a gritty reflection of the real world. Because all readers of all ages and backgrounds can understand the struggle of good and evil, it creates a more compelling narrative that is easier to engage with and follow. Tolkien tapped into the human desire to be good, to want to fight the darkness, and to hope that good can ultimately win. It's what makes Beowulf timeless, and Cinderella, and Momotaro too. The mythic tone with archetypal characters inhabiting a world that is not our own, and indeed arguably more dangerous and treacherous, but filled with people who nonetheless understand the struggle against evil, is what compels us to remember it. Nothing encapsulates this more than Galadriel's words to Frodo, when describing her and Celeborn's life. Together through the ages of the world, we have fought the long defeat, she tells him. The long defeat reflects the importance of continuing to fight for good, even when the ultimate result is defeat in some form. That even victory requires loss. This again speaks to Tolkien's personal experience. This is just one of numerous examples where the story can stir something truly deep within us. Having a message that is applicable for all people at all times is what makes The Lord of the Rings a story that will never die. If there is any theme present in the story, it is that of friendship, kindness, and love. And having the understanding that defeat is not to be mourned, but to be seen as a noble struggle against evil.
If you really come down to any large story that interests people, can hold them attention for a considerable time, or make stories, practically always, a human story is practically always about one thing, aren't they? Death. The inevitability of death. I don't know whether you would agree with that, but anyway, that is what, there was a quotation from Simon Beauvoir that I read in the paper the other day, which seems to me put it in a nutshell. I think I'll read it to him. There is no such thing as a natural death. Nothing that happens to man is ever natural, since his presence calls the whole world into question. All men must die, but for every man his death is an accident, and even if he knows it and consents to it, an unjustifiable violation. We may agree with words or not, but those are the key spring of the laws of the ring.
When I was a child, I dreamed of being Aragorn, the king to be with his beautiful elf maiden wife. But as I grew older and I spoke to other people, I started to believe that Samwise Gamgee was the true hero of the story. His love for Frodo, and his courage in the face of overwhelming odds. But recently, as I've gone back and re-examined The Lord of the Rings in more detail, and researched what Tolkien himself said about the characters within his books, it has become apparent that Frodo is the true hero of the story. Despite some of the negative attributes that he displays in the books, and more especially in the films with his treatment of Sam, it is important that we acknowledge Frodo's heroism in the story, and this leads us to why characters are so powerful and so important in making The Lord of the Rings such a successful work of art.
But that seems, well, I thought it was more like an allegory of the human race. I've always been impressed. We are here surviving because of the indomitable courage of quite small people against impossible odds, jungles, volcanoes, wild beasts. They struggle on, almost blindly in a way. Frodo had very little idea, really. Because by the time he came to the end of the quest, he was beginning to understand things very much more. I thought the wisest remark in the whole book was that where Elrond says that the wheels of the world are turned by the small hands while the great are looking elsewhere, and they turn because they have to, because it's the daily job.
Despite the more archetypal heroes such as Aragorn and Legolas being present in the books and particularly prominent within the films, Tolkien always insisted that the books were about the hobbits. He firmly believed that he was writing about the power of individual courage, of smaller people taking on enormous odds and challenges in a world far more hostile and dangerous than they could imagine. But at the end of the day, these individuals didn't shy away from the challenge. They straightened their back and went all the way to the finish line. That's what Tolkien is trying to communicate with his characters, and despite it being very easy to see this as a typical monomyth story, it's really not that simple. More than that, the characters themselves are all deeply complex personalities with motivations that are well rounded and fleshed out through the story. The world they exist in is relatively black and white, in that it's not exactly hard to see who the evil actors are in the story, and I don't know anybody who sides with Sauron, but the characters are anything but vanilla. While we may joke that Legolas in the film trilogies is not the deepest character, there are very few shallow actors in the book. The range of characters allows us to be more gripped by the narrative, as each one represents different roles, races, positions, responsibilities, statuses, and ideologies, and amazingly, this is done without making any character preachy or acting as a self-insert for the author. They are standalone figures, who interact naturally and in accordance with the established personality they have in the story. Gandalf is wise and kind, but also forthright and powerful when he needs to be. Aragorn represents an archetypical man who can survive and hunt in the wild, is a skilled warrior and diplomat, but is also sensitive by reciting poetry and songs and crying over his fallen comrades. Frodo is naive and weak, but takes great courage from his will and the people around him. He perseveres when the whole world is convinced he'll fail. Éowyn struggles with her desire for independence and freedom against her duty to Rohan, and ultimately finds her identity not in battle, but in caring for all things that grow. These are all endearing and thought-out characters that are realistic and not the result of executives dreaming up stereotypical characters to check boxes. Instead, they represent characteristics rather than character profiles. Tolkien took great care to make these independent agents within his story. As is natural, the films portrayed the characters slightly differently. However, in the books, the characters are much more central to the story, over spectacle. There is a bigger emphasis on their introspection, psychological changes, and challenges of wrestling with free will and individual responsibility. The characters in the book are rich, deep, and complex. Importantly, Tolkien adheres to his mantra of not telling the reader or audience how to feel about these characters. More than that, Tolkien was not tempted to massively deconstruct his characters, as tends to be the case in lots of modern stories. They are flawed individuals, but not because they have dark past or childhood traumas, but because they are realistic individuals who are not 10s in every facet of their personality. Boromir's flaw comes from his love of country, Faramir's from his desire to prove his worth. Even Aragorn, the most stereotypical figure in the book, is flawed in his fear of succumbing to the lust of power and his potential failure to do good. Tolkien does not spend chapters and endless conversations melting down these characters into their constituent elements. Instead, he shows us enough of who they are as individuals and lets their actions speak for the rest. Despite the descriptive nature of the world building in The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien masterfully lets his characters show who they are, rather than tell us himself. That last part is so crucial to what makes The Lord of the Rings so great. As we've talked about in my allegory video, Tolkien was very much against telling readers how to interpret his story or how they should enjoy it. We can see the same attitude continue to his world building and character development. He treasured independent thought and natural growth more than anything else, and that leads to the creation of some of the most iconic characters ever put to page. Lastly, so many of the characters provide opportunities for relatability to the reader. Despite this being a fantasy world, it is very easy to find a character in the story who we can identify with, even if they are an elf or a dwarf or a tree. We can empathise with the sadness and loss that Treebeard feels even though we're not an Ent. We can see the desire to be noble and to save one's home at any cost in Boromir, despite the fact that we are not a prince. We can aspire to have the humility of Faramir or the loyalty of Sam. We can understand the exhaustion of Galadriel, the desire for purpose of Éowyn, or wish to be wise and witty like Gandalf. Even the evil characters like Saruman or the morally grey like Denethor are understandable and relatable in some essence to us. Tolkien writes them so well that we sympathise, to some degree, with their fall from grace and even hope for their redemption. There aren't many stories that do that.
I've always thought it was remarkable that Tolkien basically spent his entire life creating what he called the secondary world. You know, he created the languages, he created the thousands of years of history. It's so rich and so detailed that nobody today that writes a piece of fiction is ever going to come close to the sheer wealth of information and detail. Of course, all of that makes it fiendishly difficult to adapt into any sort of movie.
It would be remiss of me not to mention the Peter Jackson films here, especially when we're talking about the legacy of Tolkien's work. And also because many people nowadays are exposed to The Lord of the Rings because of the films rather than the books. This video is not going to be a review of the films. Better and more qualified people have done that before me. If you are interested in hearing my take on them, I may consider doing that in the future. Instead, I want to acknowledge how powerful the legacy of the books are, and how it's because of the success and the power of the books that these films became so successful. So let's explore that in a little bit more detail. If you've ever watched the behind the scenes of the making of the films, you will see how much love and dedication Tolkien's work inspired in the production. How the power of these books pushed the creators to dedicate themselves as thoroughly as possible, in the same manner and with the same mindset as Tolkien himself did. As such, they created something worthy of receiving the most awards ever by a film. 475 wins out of 800 nominations, if you were curious. Just like the perfectionism Tolkien had for his world, the films are living proof of the power of that story to influence perfectionism in others in their art, even 50 years later.
The philosophies and the vision that will carry this film for 5 years and deliver it onto the world stage in a way that's worthy to the written literature of Tolkien, gathering around us a like-minded...
More than that, something that I think is impressive rather than reductive is that the films do not completely follow the books. Anybody who has experienced both will note the absence of Tom Bombadil, the Barrow-wights, the Grey Company and the Scouring of the Shire, to name but a handful, from the films. But rather than deride the films for this, as some have, we can celebrate how flexible and applicable the original story is. It can be interpreted freely, and still be monumentally successful and inspiring when in the right hands. When it's in the hands of somebody who honours Tolkien's ethos and moral values. Someone who is interested in telling beautiful stories as faithfully as possible. I could gush on all day about the Peter Jackson trilogy, but it's important that we acknowledge the bad portrayals of Tolkien's work too. I strongly believe that many of these exist for the simple reason that the time, energy, dedication, and honesty required to adapt these works simply wasn't there. Tolkien was a perfectionist, and therefore to reproduce his works requires the level of perfectionism that the man himself put into his stories. You simply can't reproduce Tolkien on the screen using half measures. You have to have the same energy, dedication, and passion as the writer himself, and the more modern adaptations of his work simply don't have that. While Jackson also created the Hobbit trilogy, the time and energy simply wasn't there. Especially when we know how many years of pre-production the original trilogy underwent. When we see the behind the scenes of the Hobbit trilogy, it's clear that the dedication wasn't the same. The result was a group of films that were bloated, lacked focus, and veered away from the spirit of the original book and the original film trilogy. Although Christopher Tolkien didn't approve of The Lord of the Rings, he was scathing of the Hobbit films. Then there is... I do not like this series, and I don't want to spend more time than I have to on it. I may return in the future, but I am not a TV reviewer or a critic. But if this is something you want to see, then let me know and I may try. I have many thoughts on this series, very few of which are positive, but I think, for now, I will say that this is simply not Tolkien. Not 1 ounce of his vision or world is here beyond the names and places. The Rings of Power is fan fiction, made by people who don't even come close to the dedication and love that Jackson did for his original trilogy, or for the perseverance and honesty that Tolkien had when he created the universe. That's the bottom line. If you liked it, then I'm very happy for you, and if anything, a little bit jealous. I didn't like it. We have different opinions. That's okay. Off-screen, The Lord of the Rings has had a massive impact on the world since it was published. The story and universe are so powerful that we have to thank it for giving us a new wealth of fantasy materials such as Harry Potter, The Dark Tower, and A Song of Ice and Fire. Even George Lucas has acknowledged the influence it had on Star Wars. It helped spawn Warhammer and Dungeons & Dragons and inspire games such as Zelda and Dragon Quest. It inserted new language into our collective lexicon such as Hobbit, Orc, and Dark Lord. Not bad for something written 70 years ago. As a young boy, The Lord of the Rings gave me all of the ingredients I needed to grow up to be a hardworking, diligent, and honest young man, and I know I'm not alone when I say that. Millions of people have found solace in this world and story, been inspired by the heroics of the characters, and formed worldviews influenced by what they interpret from the books. Every Tolkien fan I've ever met, I've instantly bonded with over our mutual love for this story. Even if we don't like certain elements or certain portrayals, the fans of Tolkien are amongst the kindest and most noble that I know of. I've never met another person from a different fandom who will pause the movies to explain things eagerly every 5 minutes, or who won't reference the books at every chance, or use the actions of the characters in the story to help guide them through challenging times, or have zealous-like routines to read the books or watch the films on a yearly basis. Tolkien did not describe our world now. To think that he did is a mistake. Instead, he made a new one, in which we could disappear. For those people who felt the real world was too tough, Middle-earth was there to welcome them. The poetry of Tolkien's words, his dedication to perfection, the deep and complex characters, the fascinating and rich world-building and lore, all contribute to making The Lord of the Rings one of the greatest stories ever told. I don't think we will ever see its like again, and, well, maybe that's okay.
If you were to be remembered as the man who has made The Lord of the Rings, would you rather be remembered as a man who has said something or as a man who has made something?
I don't think you can distinguish. The made thing, unless it says something, won't be remembered.